This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Regional Host Chair Allen Institute this June in Seattle for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
I'm Steve Usdin, Washington editor of BioCentury. My guest today is Richard Pops. Richard's stepping down as CEO of Alkermes in July and will remain as chairman. He has lived the modern era of biotechnology. He became CEO in 1991 at the age of 28, and Alkermes had about 24 employees. Today, it has thousands, a market cap over $6 billion, and, most importantly, a portfolio of drugs for serious psychiatric and addiction disorders that have reached millions of patients, and drugs for other serious conditions nearing the market. Alkermes has navigated the classic ups and downs of biotech: IPOs, mergers, near-death experiences, battles with activists, investors, complete response letters, everything, you name it. Throughout all of this, Richard has had a deep engagement with public policy. He chaired Bio, he serves on the board of Pharma, and he was a central figure in PDUFA reauthorization negotiations for more than, and still is, for more than 2 decades. And I've learned a lot from Richard over the years. A recurring theme in our conversations has been how economics and public policy shape what's possible in drug development, not in the abstract, but in concrete terms, what he could build, what he couldn't build, and why. And that's what I want to explore today. But I want to start actually at the beginning with something I've never asked you, and I've always wanted to, which is, how did a 28-year-old become a CEO of a drug company?
Well, it's ill-advised, I would say, but I was working in this brand new area of trying to figure out how to finance biotechnology companies. And I was young. There was a new group that had started up in New York within Payne Weber, trying to figure out sources of capital for the first biotech companies who had gone public: Genentech, Amgen, Cedus, Chiron, who had gone public with great expectations about the power of recombinant DNA technology, but then proceeded to obviously disappoint investors because the products were a long way off. So we were innovating these different types of R&D limited partnerships and other direct investments to try to support what we knew would probably end up being a really transformational technology. And through that, I met a guy named Michael Wall, who had founded Centocor, and he asked me to come up and join Alkermes. And in the beginning, I didn't know what job he wanted me to do, but he asked me to be the CEO. And after I smiled and laughed, he said he was serious. And of course, the rest is history.
So Alkermes started as a drug delivery company. And the idea was pretty simple: changing a daily medication to treat schizophrenia into a twice-monthly injection would increase adherence and improve lives. That same logic drove your drugs to treat addiction. And you went there. You went into addiction when Big Pharma stayed away. They're low-cost drugs, relatively low-cost drugs, intended for really large populations with really obvious benefits. So you'd think this would be rewarded. What happened in practice? Why did something that seemed like an obvious idea and something that everybody should get behind, how did that actually play out?
Well, it worked until it didn't. And the general principle that you were touching on is we actually didn't start doing that. When I came to the company, it was focused on understanding the blood-brain barrier. And so the idea was that's either a neuroscience company or a drug delivery company. But again, the environment forces adaptation. So the public capital markets closed in the early 90s after a couple of spectacular failures, namely a company you'll remember called Synergen. And so all of a sudden that investing model became out of favor. But the drug delivery piece that we were doing, we morphed into the drug delivery piece, which had the virtue of pharmaceutical companies would pay your bills rather than the equity markets, and we could develop our first products in that fashion. It led then to an understanding of the unmet needs of these patients with serious mental illness and addiction. And there, the issue wasn't so much needing to develop a brand new medicine, but we realized in talking to patients that some of the principal limitations were just their ability to take their medicines on a daily basis because of their diagnosis. And that's what led to the long-acting injectables, which conferred major patient benefit to patients. And those medicines are still being used. We're extremely proud of them. But what then subsequently happened is that the payer environment shifted to the point where payers began to say, you know what, We're not going to pay for medicines that aren't new medicines. Derivatives of existing medicines, albeit highly advantageous for patients, they're not as valuable to society anymore. So again, that began the morphing into ultimately where we ended up to be today.
So the other thing, one of the things that's evolved, and you're kind of alluding to it here, I think, is that the whole PBM model and the way that it influences the kinds of drugs companies can develop and the way that they can price them, that has evolved tremendously in the time period that you've been doing this. Can you talk a little bit about those changes and what impacts they have on you as a CEO in developing and kind of and what kinds of drugs you can develop and how you have to price them and so on?
Well, if you're not thinking about that as an initial part of the filtration of what you choose to work on in a biotech company now, you're not doing your job. And it's completely different than when we began in this business, Steve. In the beginning, it was all driven by the power of a new technology being unleashed, namely recombinant DNA technology, thinking that we could make drugs. And if you made drugs that were safe and effective and approved by the FDA, then patients would get access to them. And the whole origin of our relationship and my focus on policy derives from several years ago when we get our first medicines approved and realize what a triumph of the science, of the engineering, of the manufacturing, of the regulatory process, FDA approval, and people were going to get access to them because there was an intermediary who was making the decisions. And that intermediary had legitimate business interests, but could be influenced by public policy. And you had to engage at that level in order to make sure your medicines could get to patients. So today, I mean, I think it's one of the starting points for deciding whether you even to do discovery research is, are you going to end up in an area where you can have favorable ability to access patients if you're successful?
So you won't even start, and your colleagues, they won't even start down this road, even if there's an opportunity to create a transformational medicine, if it doesn't fit into the funding model that PBMs and other payers have created.
Now, transformational by definition probably is a place to be, right? Irrespective of if you're transforming medicine, if you're completely making obsolete what precedes you in that space, that's exciting. But that's almost where the bar has become now. And you know how science works. Science works often quite incrementally. And those increments add up over time to transformation. So we're losing in the industry the ability to make small improvements from time to time. And now I think a lot of us, as we were talking about allocating capital for R&D activities, you're looking for white space, places where you can really do something that hasn't been done before, which I think is a good thing, by the way. I think I think that's fine. But you have to be cognizant of the fact that there's other decision makers at the table other than the patient and the physician and the FDA.
And going back to the addiction and to the mental health drugs, one of the things that I wonder is whether the system as it's created now and as it's evolved, will it support the development of drugs for these very large conditions, common conditions, where you're going to inherently have relatively low prices? You'd think that's what you would want, but it doesn't seem that that's the way the system's not really set up to reward that.
The system, quote unquote, was not intelligently designed. It just is what it is. And the economic incentives are real. So take the example we talk about a lot, which is post-IRA, 9 years of exclusivity versus 13 years of exclusivity. If you draw a curve of the revenue profile of a drug over its life with the ramp and the plateau, and you clip off the back 4 years, that's half of the revenues. So from a purely economic perspective, you should develop biologics instead of small molecules. That's a powerful incentive to shift allocation of capital, separate from the scientific underpinnings of it all. That's just one of many examples in the system where the policy drives behavior. So to your point, serious mental illness and addiction, where we've lived for a long time, what do you have to sign up for? You have to sign up for the fact that you're going to be paying half of your revenues to PBMs to get onto the formulary. For our antipsychotics, for example, patients are required to fail on multiple generics, sometimes as many as five generics before they can get access to the medicine. And
which is horrible if you think about it.
It's horrible. There's nothing defensible about it. When a patient with a serious chronic disease, a decision is made by a physician intelligently to provide a specific medicine to them, that they're forcing, well, that's a good idea, but why don't you fail 4 or 5 other drugs? Because what that means is probably 4 or 5 years of the patient's life where they're cycling through ineffective medications, relapse, progression, and so on. So no, it's horrific. And in the field of addiction, of course, there's not much drug development that goes on in addiction. Why? Because addiction is treated outside of our medical system. It's not something that is, so if you walk into a methadone clinic, you get treated with methadone. If you walk into a physician who prescribes buprenorphine, you'll be prescribed buprenorphine. Many people abdicate no medicines at all, 12-step program. So these are places where you can see capital isn't flowing for innovation because you can charge $20,000 a month for a new biologic for treating cancer. So from a business perspective, that's probably a better place to spend your R&D dollars than one where you're going to be fighting against the headwinds that I just described.
So the IRA, I want to go back to the IRA now. So the IRA did 2 big things for drug development, and people focus on one of them rightly, which is the 9 to 13 year exclusivity periods, essentially, for small molecules versus large molecules. It also changed the structure of Medicare Part D. Sticking with the first one for a moment, can you talk a little bit about, from your seat and from talking to your colleagues and from investors, what has been the impact of the 9 and 13 years on the kinds of drugs that are developed and on the kind of innovation that happens after a drug is approved?
So when you're thinking about running an R&D organization, the first question you would ask yourself for a particular biological pathway or a particular target, can a logical embodiment be in a biologic? If it's a toss-up between a small molecule embodiment and a biologic, you go with a biologic.
Even though that's not going to be better for the patient, and it's certainly not going to be better for the healthcare system as a whole.
You'd have to figure out that there's always this tension. If it really is a better medicine to do it the other way for the patient, for the system, you have to go that way. That's just the right thing to do. I don't know if everybody does that, but that's the way we would think about it. But the other way, let's say that you choose that a small molecule embodiment is the right thing to do, which is often the case for CNS drugs. Well, then what you can't do is what Keytruda and Merck did, which is invest over a decade in indication after indication, dosing regimen, combinations to exploit the full biology through ongoing clinical research. Because there's a finite, you light a fuse, it's a 9-year fuse. And you can't invest beyond the point of it being economic within that window. So what do? You have to make another molecule. And that other molecule may have advantages or disadvantages versus the parent one. But there's something to be said for all the intellectual capital that's been in economic capital that's been invested in something like Keytruda, because you really understand the biology, you understand its multiple implications for patients and their well-being. Starting in the later lines, moving up to earlier lines, ultimately first line, its interactions with our medicine. There's just so much richness in these development programs that can be revealed. And I think a lot of that's gone now.
And it's an example of something that's gone. People won't necessarily know it because it's something that could have happened that isn't happening. And you have to have confidence in people like you that what you're saying is true in order to even appreciate the fact that you're not getting something that could have happened. And that trust, has broken down. We can talk about that later. The Medicare piece of it, Medicare Part D redesign, people don't talk about that very much. Is that something that's affected the kinds of drugs that you can develop and the way that you do drug development?
For sure. I mean, if you and I were starting a company from scratch today, and our only goal was economic return for our investors, you would make biologics for rare populations that are paid for by commercial payers. It's simple. So as you enmesh yourself in the labyrinth of Medicare and Medicaid and government pay systems, it's a different world. Price points are typically lower, rebates are higher, with exceptions, but as a general rule. But this is where the vast amount of human suffering lies, in major chronic diseases. And so I wish there were more incentive for people to develop drugs in those spaces. And in the Med D redesign, for example, we at Alkermes played a really important part catalyzing lawmakers to understand that if you recall back, this is a little bit in the weeds, but one of the features of the Part D redesign was the exposure of manufacturers to a 20% liability in the catastrophic phase, which previously hadn't existed.
Catastrophic meaning after a certain amount of money that it has been spent, then the economics of the whole thing shift. And what's happened in the redesign is that after a certain amount of money has been spent, then manufacturers have to pay 20% of the costs going forward without any limit. No,
precisely. Previously, the government had paid that, and the insurance companies had paid that. So for a company like ours, who we felt like we had done the right thing, focusing on these patients in Part D, these schizophrenic patients with reimbursement as duals, rebating high amounts into the system, behaving responsibly as an actor, that would have taken us from a 0% liability to a 20% tax on our revenues. It would have taken us from being profitable to being not being profitable. So we sat down with policymakers and we catalyzed the formation of what became the phase-in, which over a number of years will ramp to that 20% liability. So it's still quite painful, but it would have been catastrophic for us had we not done that. And that experience actually led to our forming what we're calling the Mid-Sized Biotech Alliance of America, the MBAA, which is now 13 or 14 companies, but all with a similar origin story, which 20, 25 years to get to profitability, fighting our way through all the travails of building a biotech company, getting a commercial product, but realizing that you're subject to the vicissitudes of policymakers with unintended consequences that could disproportionately affect companies with only one or two products.
And we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the IRA. I want to talk about MFN and the FDA, and how some of the changes that are happening or that have happened disproportionately affect what I call the engines of innovation, the small and the middle-sized companies. We'll be right back.
This episode of the BioCentury Show is brought to you by the third BioCentury Grand Rounds in Seattle. Advancing drug development requires more than discovery. It requires the right partners. The third edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds US convenes venture capital, biopharma decision makers, and academic innovators in Seattle, June 3rd to 5th. This R&D-focused forum brings together leaders at the forefront of translational science to examine the breakthroughs, bottlenecks, and strategies shaping the future of drug and diagnostic development, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Discover cutting-edge disease biology and platform technologies. Gain insights from emerging biotechs and academic pioneers. Schedule partnering meetings with VCs, pharma, and leading academics who can accelerate your path forward. Grand Rounds US is where rigorous science meets strategic capital, and where the right conversations move discovery toward development. Join us in Seattle and discover what's next in biopharma and who's driving it. Secure your spot. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm back with Richard Pops, CEO and soon-to-be chairman of Alkermes. Richard, so you were talking about the effects of some of these policy changes on middle and size and small companies. There's the IRA, but there's also MFN, most favored nation. The idea behind MFN seems to be pretty simple. Get countries outside of the United States to pay their fair share for R&D. Make sure that big companies don't have monopolies on pricing indefinitely in the United States. Try to reshore manufacturing to the United States. All of those things are things that I think are relatively non-controversial, but it hasn't really played out that way, has it?
Well, there is no MFN draft legislation. We don't know what MFN actually is. Everything you just recited all makes sense to you don't have to be in the industry to understand why do Americans pay much more than other countries. That should be fixed. That's a trade issue as well as a US pricing issue. So I think the political instinct to go after it is sound. It's the implementation. And what we don't know is, based on the 17 bespoke deals that have been done, is there a central tendency among them, or is each of them actually a bespoke deal? And if there's a central theme that runs through them, the companies can figure out a way that is still economic, that it's not going to impair innovation, I mean, we're all ears. Let's look at that. But let's make sure in the rush to try to create a fix, just like we talked about in the Part D legislation, slow down, make sure that we're not doing something in an unintended way that could hurt mid-sized companies or the innovators. Let me give you a perfect example, Steve, at MFN. So Alkermes, for example, we don't sell our drugs in Europe at a lower price. We don't sell them at any price because we didn't think that the prices that Europe were willing to pay for our medicines was fair. So we don't. Now, you'd say, well, then we're not affected by MFN. But what if one of our competitors does? And all of a sudden the legislation is written that in so doing, they have to pay a large rebate back to the United States. Now, formularies might be incented to use that drug because they get paid a large rebate rather than our drug, which is fairly priced from the outset. That would be an unintended consequence, but a profound one to us because it would shift formulary preference to a medicine based on the economic consequences of prescribing it. And there's, the draft legislation are replete with these types of hazards. And I think we just have to be really vigilant about that.
Well, and there's also a situation where if you're a large multinational pharmaceutical company, you've got a big portfolio of products, and one of them, for example, competes with one of your products, they can afford possibly to take a big hit like that because it's not going to affect their overall profitability very much. But it might be something, it's like a wave, it might be like swamp a smaller or mid-sized company where that's one of their only products, right?
Precisely. The other thing is that, so we build these companies, we attract our employees, we animate people over a decade to make these medicines because we want to get them to patients. And if you do this correctly, soulfully, for many years, you get very moved by the impact that your medicines can have on patients. Over 200,000 people will get Alkermes medicines this year. So we didn't develop them for them not to get access to it in Europe and in Japan and in China. And in fact, it truncates the whole opportunity set. So if we can't sell in Europe because Europe isn't going to pay fair prices, you might say that's fair, but you know who will come in and sell our medicine to Europeans? The Chinese will.
Yeah.
The structures are known, they're being made, and so we relinquish most of the world to somebody else that has sort of geopolitical implications, but also for our own companies, our revenue base is smaller, means we can invest less in R&D, we can make less medicines, we can hire fewer people, we can build fewer plants, all that stuff, the whole opportunity just shrinks. So MFN needs to be done correctly. And there's probably a way to do it correctly that equilibrates prices across the world in a more equitable way. But I think rushing fast to do something is and thankfully you know better than I. But I think that's less likely to happen in this legislative session at the moment, given the way that the year has evolved.
But I wonder even more fundamentally the precedence that's been set by 17 CEOs going to the administration and negotiating separate deals, going to the White House and having these press conferences where the president announces the deals that he's done with the companies. What kind of a precedent does that set? Are future presidents going to be able to resist the urge to do the same thing, maybe even in a rather unpredictable way, calling companies in to do negotiation over the pricing of specific drugs? And if that happens, what does that do to the ecosystem for creating innovative drugs?
Well, we don't know what's in those agreements. So what's the good side of it? The good side is that the pharmaceutical industry shows its ability to say, no, we're interested in adapting to address a problem that America has identified as a problem. And I'm encouraged by that because if you're going to do that, if you're going to open up that box, what's inside that box? Insurance benefit reform, PBMs, 340B, all that stuff that's not just the price of the drugs. And I can tell you the pharmaceutical industry is excited to engage in that type of public policy discussion. The rifle shot on drug prices, that's what's happening for a moment. But I think you can tell by the fact that 17 companies are willing to come in and have that conversation, there's a there. And so I'm going to remain optimistic that there's a way of solving this.
So I want to shift over because there's another thing that you've been deeply involved in, which is FDA and regulatory reform, in particular using PDUFA. I think You probably you led the way in realizing that PDUFA could be more than just a way to provide supplemental funding to FDA and tie those funds to a goal for reviews. And also that it could be more than just a sporadic negotiation that happens every 5 years and turn into something that's more like a continuous engagement between industry and FDA. I see you're smiling. Can you talk a little bit about, how you think about PDUFA and how you think about the way that what it's achieved and what the relationship is between industry and FDA as a result of it?
But I'm smiling because I was actually sitting at the table with David Kessler and a group of people early in my career when we talked about PDUFA 1. And smart people at the time recognized the slippery slope that we were putting ourselves on at the time. Once you open the aperture to say industry is willing to fund scientific activities, namely new drug review activities at FDA, there's only one way that directional arrow goes over time. And so in the beginning, PDUFA, provided like 5% of the new drug review dollars, and now it's over 80%. And it's not really a negotiation as much anymore, but a discussion about how to optimize the program. PDUFA 5 was the first time I was sort of asked by bio and pharma to sort of lead a coordinated response to the every 5-year program, because you could see that it was losing momentum in terms of its ability to deliver useful change. It was just getting bigger and more expensive, and things weren't getting better. So in PDUFA 5, we introduced the program, capital P, which set up the basic architecture that exists today with filing times and mid-cycle reviews and the various interactions that describe the process from IND to NDA. And each year we've tried to be fastidious about that. Each 5-year period, FDA typically wants more headcount, industry wants more output, and most recently, the ambitions have been scaled back to some extent. Let's get back to the core mission, because what happened was that we were beginning to fund all kinds of new initiatives within FDA, pilot programs, exploratory things, and it was beginning to metastasize to the point where the core mission was not moving. We were getting more complete response letters, more facilities inspections were delaying NDAs, and so on. PDUFA 8, which we've just finished the negotiations on, you'll see more of it later this year, sort of a return to basics. But to your point, until PDUFA 5, we never had a continuous engagement with the FDA between FDA and PDUFA negotiation bouts. And one of the things that I and others said, what we should do, guys, is if we're going to spend all this money and create this, we shouldn't just show up every 5 years and reintroduce ourselves. We should be looking at this multiple times a year to make sure we're meeting the goals for the public health as well as the economics of the program. I think that's proven to be a really, really useful thing. And so the program has become the primary way to effect change within FDA.
So one of the things, over the years, I remember talking with you about different PDUFA negotiations is the emphasis on recruitment and retaining staff at FDA and a kind of level of frustration that companies had that FDA's ability to do that didn't match its aspirations, it didn't match its needs, and partly that was because of sclerotic HR functions that were nothing like what you would expect in the private sector and so on. Fast forward, over the last year, 20% of FDA staff on the drug review side approximately have walked out the door, either been pushed out or walked out. So in a way, it looks like all the progress that you made over all those years to get more staffing into FDA and to keep people there so they had that institutional knowledge, a lot of that's really been undone over the last year. What do you think about that, and what does it look like again, from your seat? You're trying to develop drugs. How does it different when you're dealing with an FDA where 1 out of 5 people who were there a year and a half ago aren't there anymore?
Well, it was one of the most eye-opening parts of learning about FDA or all that multi-year period was, I think it was when Peggy Hamburg was the commissioner, and the evergreen issue on our continuous engagement meetings with FDA, the evergreen issue is hiring and retention. And what you learned in the beginning was incredibly Byzantine. That they didn't even have their own HR group. It ran through the White House or through some group in Atlanta, and they had restrictions on the pay thresholds. You've reported on this really responsibly for many years, and we fought to do things legislatively to alleviate some of these constraints, and we're really successfully. And so the hiring process was getting better. It was never perfect, but it was getting better. And what we were hoping to get to a state where people realize that as a scientific career, it wouldn't be a bad idea to go inside of FDA and then come out of FDA or come from industry. And we still didn't get there, this idea of this increased porosity between industry, because there's a fear, right? The regulated industry is somehow controlling the regulator. And that's never been the case at FDA. And it's also, your question, it refers to the fact that there's a certain level of expertise that's required to do the job. FDA has told us that it takes 2 years to train a medical reviewer, for example, and maybe another year or so for them to become an independent operator as a medical reviewer. So when you lose, we have a big efflux of that knowledge base. It's very hard to just replace it, even with new hiring. So going forward now, FDA has to reestablish its scientific base, and it will over time. I mean, that just by necessity, it has to happen for two reasons: just to handle the base work, but also we in industry, we're pushing the technology all the time. There's new stuff that's being invented, and the regulators, you need a strong regulator on the other side of the table who understands what we're doing in our laboratories. And so it's in our best interest to make sure that regulatory body is as strong and as scientifically proficient as possible. And you're right, we're a bit of a nadir right now, but it needs to change.
So it's pretty much impossible to have any conversation now about biopharma, about drug development, about medicine without talking about China. It's in every discussion. And I'm wondering, how you think about China and how you think about collaboration and competition with China, because I hear both sides of it. I hear some people saying, that there should be restrictions on investment in China or engagement between U.S. companies and China that were fueling an adversary. Other people who say no, that they should be integrated into the ecosystem, and also that they kind of they force us to be better because they force us to focus, like you were saying earlier, on the white spaces, on the new areas, because they're so good and so fast at moving into the areas that have been identified. And frankly, they're also moving into innovation. But, how do you think about it?
I think it's a critical topic. China vis-a-vis AI, China vis-a-vis biopharmaceutical innovation. The scale at which they're operating is astonishing. And somebody said to me recently, something I really like, which is the only thing scarier than somebody who hasn't been to China recently is somebody who went 3 years ago and thinks they know what's happening in China, because the growth on the biopharmaceutical side is so nonlinear, and the scale of medicinal chemistry, biostatistical computing, manufacturing, name it, any one of the functional disciplines, they have multiples of what we have in the United States, and they're dead set on doing it well. So, the policy aspects of it are debatable. What I do know is that big pharma is sourcing there for innovation, not just for copycat. They're sourcing there for innovation now. And I think that anybody who's allocating R&D dollars these days has to have a point of view, not just about sourcing molecules from China, but also development, translational work in hospitals where they have large-scale clinical trial facilities. You can get to answers about biological questions in the human system faster in places outside the U.S. And that isn't carved in stone. We can fix that in the U.S. from a policy perspective if we have the gumption to do so. But make no mistake, it's happening. It's happening in China.
So yeah, I want to end with that. Your thoughts about what the United States can and should do from a policy perspective to respond, not only to respond to the competition from China, but really to live up to the potential of the industry. Because one of the things I've always thought, you've got these billions of dollars that are pouring into this industry, and the truth is you have a trickle of transformational drugs or important drugs that come out every year at extraordinarily high prices. And it seems to me that both of those things don't need to be true. We could have more drugs, and we could have them at lower prices if public policy were better aligned with the scientific opportunities.
Well, you and I have been doing this for a long time. And when we started in this business, the assumption was not that we would make medicines that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, right? And the ecosystem flourished and companies got started and things seem to function. So I think there is a model that says that we don't necessarily have to veer unidirectionally toward these super high price medicines for small patient populations. I think what I hear from people, and I can just sense in our own company, when you create value through doing innovative science, one of the most important nodes is that first in man experience. So you spend many years designing molecules, running through toxicology studies, biological studies, everything. Most of them fail. You finally get something that looks like a drug development candidate. And now you want to test it in the species of interest. And if it takes 2 years and a year in front of an IRB and all kinds of toxicological requirements that are unnecessary before you can ask that first experiment to see whether it works at all, whether you have dose response, whether the pharmacokinetics are intact, whether unintended consequences. If you can get to that node as fast as possible, you can create value very, very quickly. So I think from a low-hanging fruit, from a policy perspective, that's not just an FDA thing. That's IRBs, that's contracting, that's academic sites, it's commercial sites. It's everybody in a concerted way saying, how do we make sure that it makes more sense to develop a drug in the US rather than in Australia or China or someplace else? That to me seems like a solvable problem.
So it's creating an intentional infrastructure for clinical trials, for clinical research in the United States. It's optimized for speed, for safety, and for getting signals out.
Exactly.
Rather than a kind of what we have now, which is not a system, it's not optimized. It's kind of like a medieval workshop approach.
You're setting off on a barge for a 10-year program that'll end up in an NDA, right? And we're all comfortable doing that because we've done it for so long. But you have to ask yourself first principles: why?
Well, great. Well, thanks, Richard. We've gone over the time that we were supposed to here. We always do. I really appreciate your thoughts, and let's stay in touch. Let's do it again.
Thank you, Steve.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Regional Host Chair Allen Institute this June in Seattle for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.